September 16, 1581. The sun sets over the main square of Neumarkt, in the heart of Bavaria. A crowd gathers in a circle around a wooden construction that rises like a profane altar in the center of the square. Upon this structure, a giant oak wheel waits in silence. At the edges of the multitude, children are lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to witness the spectacle about to begin. Everyone knows they will witness something extraordinary, the execution of the most feared man in the entire region. The guards appear, escorting a figure that barely seems human. Decades of heinous crimes have transformed Peter Niers into a dark legend that haunted the roads and forests of Germany. His face, marked by scars and the cruelty of a lifetime devoted to evil, reveals only contempt for the crowd observing him. In moments, he will face one of the most brutal execution methods ever conceived by humanity. He will be broken on the wheel, having every bone in his body systematically shattered before being burned alive. But how does a man become such a terrible monster that his death must be transformed into an unprecedented spectacle of horror? The answer leads us to the bloody roads of 16th century Europe, where Peter Niers wrote his name in history as one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. The story of Peter Niers begins in the mists of a neglected childhood and extreme poverty. Born around 1540 somewhere in Franconia, he grew up in an era when Europe was torn by religious wars, famine, and plague. Orphaned at an early age, he wandered the roads as a beggar before discovering he had a talent for something far more sinister: murder. Niers's first crimes were motivated by the basic necessity of survival. He attacked solitary travelers on deserted roads, killing them for a few coins and a piece of bread. But what began as desperation soon transformed into something much darker. Peter discovered that he enjoyed killing. He did not merely tolerate the violence necessary for his robberies. He savored it, prolonged it, refined it. For more than 40 years, Niers terrorized the trade routes between Franconia and Bavaria. His victims were primarily merchants, pilgrims, and travelers who had the misfortune of crossing his path. But Peter was no simple bandit. He developed elaborate torture methods, keeping his victims alive for entire days while subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. Records from the period describe Peter Niers as a man of medium stature, but impressive physical strength. His eyes were described as soulless, and his hands, always blood-stained, trembled constantly, not from fear, but from a perverse excitement that only violence could satisfy. He traveled with a small gang of equally degenerate accomplices, but he was always the one who led the attacks and decided the fate of the victims. What made Peter Niers particularly terrifying was not only the number of his victims, estimated at over 500 people throughout his criminal career, but the ritualistic nature of his crimes. He developed a morbid obsession with cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims and keeping other pieces as macabre trophies. Reports from the era mention that he always carried with him a leather sack where he stored fingers, ears, and other human fragments. But there was something even more disturbing about Peter Niers' behavior. He fervently believed that consuming human flesh granted him supernatural powers. This belief led him to develop a particular preference for children, whose hearts he devoured while still warm, convinced this would make him invincible. Witnesses who survived his attacks reported seeing him whisper incantations while performing his cannibalistic rituals. Peter Niers' sinister reputation spread rapidly throughout the region. Parents used his name to frighten disobedient children. Travelers changed their routes to avoid areas where he was known to operate. Increasingly larger rewards were offered for his capture, but he always managed to escape, as if protected by diabolical forces. Local authorities organized several expeditions to hunt him, but Peter knew every trail, every cave, every hiding place in the region's forests. He had transformed the territory into an extension of his own malignancy, establishing a network of informants among lesser criminals and desperate people whom he protected in exchange for loyalty. For decades, Peter Niers remained like a bloody shadow, hovering over the region. But even the most skillful monsters eventually make mistakes, and Peter's mistake was underestimating the determination of one particular man. Georg Amann, magistrate of Neumarkt, whose family had been brutally murdered by Niers years earlier. Amann dedicated his entire life to capturing the serial killer. He studied his patterns, mapped his movements, infiltrated spies into his network of contacts. In August 1581, he finally managed to corner Peter Niers in an isolated cabin in the forest, where the criminal had taken refuge after yet another massacre. The capture of Peter Niers was an event that shook the entire region. When news spread, crowds flocked to Neumarkt to see the man who had become a legend of terror. Chained in the city's prison, he continued to display disturbing behavior, laughing without reason and muttering incomprehensible words. Peter Niers's trial was more of a formality than a proper legal proceeding. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Hundreds of witnesses, dozens of survivors willing to recount their ordeals, and his own macabre trophies found in his possession. But what truly sealed his fate was his own confession. During interrogation, Peter not only admitted his crimes, but described them in nauseating detail, apparently proud of his work. He spoke of specific torture techniques, of the taste of human flesh, of the rituals he believed gave him power. His accounts were so disturbing that some of those present in the courtroom left vomiting. The sentence was announced with solemn pomp. Peter Niers would be executed by the method of the wheel, but not an ordinary execution. Considering the magnitude of his crimes, the authorities decided he would suffer an especially prolonged and brutal version of this method. First, he would be tortured with red-hot pincers. Then, his bones would be systematically broken. Finally, he would be burned alive while still conscious. The execution was scheduled for September 16th, a date that became a local holiday celebrating justice. During the days preceding the event, pilgrims and the curious traveled from distant cities to witness the end of the man who had terrorized the region for so long. On the morning of the execution, Peter Niers was brought to the center of Neumarkt's main square. The crowd that gathered was so large that authorities needed extra guards to maintain order. Street vendors circulated offering food and drink, transforming the event into a macabre popular fair. The execution equipment had been specially constructed for the occasion. The oak wheel measured over 6 feet in diameter and was mounted on a structure that allowed it to be turned slowly. Beside it, braziers burned with pincers and branding irons heated until they glowed red-hot. A pile of kindling awaited the final act. Peter Niers was stripped and tied to the wheel with thick ropes. Even at that moment, he showed neither fear nor repentance. His eyes remained empty, as if this terrible reality were just another of the nightmares he had inflicted upon hundreds of other people. The torture began with red-hot pincers being applied to specific points on his body. First the feet, then the hands, then the chest. With each application, skin sizzled and the smell of burned flesh spread across the square. Peter screamed, but his screams seemed more of rage than pain, as if he were furious at being unable to escape this situation. After an hour of torture with the heated irons, came the main part of the execution, the breaking of bones. The executioner, an experienced man specially hired for the occasion, began with the fingers of hands and feet. One by one, each bone was carefully broken with a heavy hammer, producing a dry sound that the crowd heard in morbid silence. The breaking of larger bones was even more brutal. Peter's forearms were placed on the edge of the wheel and crushed with precise blows. The same happened to his legs, his arms, his ribs. With each blow, he howled in pain, but his voice gradually grew weaker as shock and blood loss began to exact their toll. The entire process of bone breaking lasted over 2 hours. When it was finished, Peter Niers was no longer recognizable as a human being. His body had become a shapeless mass of flesh and shattered bones, but he was still alive, still conscious, still capable of feeling every second of agony. The final act was lighting the pyre beneath the wheel. Flames slowly licked at Peter's shattered feet, gradually climbing up his mutilated body. Even then, even while facing the most horrible death imaginable, he did not ask for forgiveness, did not beg for mercy. His final moments were marked by the same cold hatred that had characterized his entire life. Peter Niers' execution lasted nearly 5 hours, from the beginning of torture until the moment flames finally consumed his body. When everything was over, his ashes were scattered to the wind to ensure that no trace of this evil remained. Peter Niers' death marked the end of an era of terror in the region. Roads became safe again, families could travel without fear, and the name that had haunted an entire generation finally became merely a dark memory. But Peter Niers' story leaves us with disturbing questions about the nature of human evil. How can a man become a monster so completely devoid of humanity? What circumstances transform an orphaned child into a cannibalistic serial killer? And perhaps more importantly, what lessons can we draw from his story to prevent other Peter Niers from arising in our world? The answer perhaps lies in the very brutality of the era in which he lived. In a society where violence was commonplace, where human life had little value, where orphaned children were abandoned to their fate, someone like Peter Niers was almost inevitable. He was a product of his time, an extreme manifestation of the darkness that dwells in the most shadowy corners of human nature. Today, more than 400 years later, Neumarkt's Square is a peaceful place where tourists buy souvenirs and families picnic. Few know that in that very location, centuries ago, one of history's most malevolent men met his end on a torture wheel. But if we listen carefully to the wind that blows between the ancient buildings, we might still hear the echoes of that brutal execution that marked the end of a legend of terror. The story of Peter Niers, the criminal who was burned, mutilated, and crushed by the wheel, remains as a dark reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, justice eventually prevails. Even if that justice comes in the most brutal and primitive form, it still represents the victory of civilization over barbarity, of light over darkness, of good over absolute evil.